My husband is in love with his student. I have no idea what to do. My name is Emily. From the outside, our lives probably look like a neat sequence of ideal milestones. But sometimes, what you see on the surface doesn't tell the whole story underneath. My husband, Michael, and I met during our sophomore year at the University of Michigan. Both of us were pursuing degrees that promised intense careers, mine in architecture and his in medicine. Our paths crossed in an elective course, History of Modern Europe, a subject far from our majors. Perhaps that's why we noticed each other. In the crowd of future doctors and architects, our meeting was as mundane as it was fateful. It was fateful, a spilled coffee, a stack of medical textbooks teetering. I reached out precariously to help, and our stories intertwined from that moment on. He apologized for the mess, his voice calm, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the cafeteria. We had briefly discussed our classes, and our classmates laughed at the serendipity of our majors colliding and our exchanging numbers, which grew from those brief encounters. We spent long nights discussing everything from Renaissance literature to the intricacies of human anatomy. In me, he found a burst of creativity and warmth from the start. Michael was the kind of man who charmed people effortlessly. His charisma wasn't the flashy kind that fades after a few encounters. Instead, it was a gentle magnetism coupled with a brilliant mind that fascinated me. I have endless memories of our study sessions. He'd relate historical events to human behavior with such passion that even the driest facts seemed to come alive. Amidst the books and spilled coffee, our conversations would stretch into the night, often closing the library at midnight. By the time we graduated, there was no question that we would get married. We tied the knot 2 years after graduation in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by family and friends. It was simple and beautiful, just the way we wanted our lives to be. Being together felt like a constant adventure, from our small apartment filled with mismatched furniture to our discussions about future dreams and aspirations. Fast forward 8 years, and we celebrated the birthday of our daughter, Sophie, born in the early, uncertain days of 2020. She was a light in a time of global upheaval. Michael had become a respected professor at a medical school, revered by his students for the same reasons he had once captivated me. His career had flourished in the ways we had imagined, and he carried his responsibilities with an admirable balance of seriousness and dedication. Michael's career as a professor at the local medical school was a source of pride for both of us. He loved teaching and the spark in his students' eyes when complex concepts finally made sense. I watched him grow over the years into a role that seemed made for him, a mentor, educator, and occasionally a friend to his students. He often shared stories from the hospital, which filled our conversations with fascinating, if sometimes gruesome, details. His dedication was as evident as the exhaustion that sometimes showed on his features after a long day. I, for one, had put my own career on hold to focus on raising Sophie. It was a decision that felt right, despite the shadow it cast on my professional ambitions. I had never really questioned the normality of this life. It was comforting in its own way. My days revolved around playdates and teacher meetings, interspersed with freelance design projects when time allowed. Michael and I were a team, or so I believed. We navigated the challenges of parenthood and work with a kind of synchronized rhythm that our friends envied. Sarah, a fellow colleague in Michael's department, had become one of my closest friends. Over the years, our friendship had transcended mere comfort and entered the realm of genuine affection and respect. Sarah had been there through every major milestone, my pregnancy, Sophie's birth, and every minor crisis in between. She was vibrant, outspoken, and fiercely intelligent. Our friendship was based on mutual professional respect and a shared love of vintage jazz music. She knew Michael as well as anyone in the professional maze of academia. Their friendship, rooted in years of collaboration, seemed just another part of the normality of our lives. She was a constant in our lives, trusted implicitly by both Michael and me. Sarah had always been straightforward, which made her recent behavior all the more puzzling to me in the weeks leading up to that unsettling lunch. There were subtle changes in the way she spoke about Michael. It began with offhand comments that seemed to hover on the edge of caution, suggesting that I should keep a closer eye on him, not only as a husband but also in his professional life. Each time such a suggestion came up, she would quickly steer the conversation to less sensitive topics such as department politics or upcoming college events. "Just watch how he is," Sarah would murmur as we watched Michael interact with colleagues at a faculty meeting. Then, seeing my furrowed brow, she'd laugh and wave off her previous comment. "I mean, look how he manages to charm everyone. You caught quite a catch." It was disturbing, this pattern of hinting at something and then retreating into platitudes about Michael's charm and professional dedication. Michael was unwavering. He was not only my husband but also the father of my child, a man who had always held the highest standards of integrity and affection in our marriage. How could I suspect him of inappropriate behavior? Michael was deeply committed to his role as a professor. He had always taken his responsibility to provide guidance and support to his students seriously while maintaining professional boundaries. His love for us was evident, and his dedication was unwavering. So when Sarah insinuated that there was something I should be wary of, it felt like a betrayal of the trust one had placed in him. Each time Sarah made these cryptic comments, I watched Michael more closely, looking for any signs that might justify her insinuations. Yet nothing seemed out of place. His interactions with colleagues and students were as they always had been, respectful and professional. At home, he was the attentive husband and loving father. He often spoke of his students with pride but never crossed the line of inappropriate affection. But Sarah's behavior became increasingly strange. She sometimes seemed distracted, her gaze lingering on Michael a little too long during social events. Her comments became more pointed, tinged with an undertone I couldn't understand. "Emily, you know, sometimes people change, right? Work situations can get complicated," she said one night as we were cleaning up after a dinner party. Her tone was serious, lacking her usual lightness. "Sarah, are you okay?" "You've been a little off," I replied, worried about my friend, who now seemed to be carrying a burden she was reluctant to share. She paused and frowned, wrinkling her forehead. "It's nothing. Just work stress, I suppose. You know, it's always good to keep an eye on things." Her ambiguity frustrated me. What was she hinting at, if anything? If there was a real concern, why not just come right out and say it? Sarah's behavior continued to gnaw at me, a constant reminder that something wasn't quite right. Yet every time I looked at Michael, every time we shared a laugh or a quiet evening together, Sarah's insinuations seemed ridiculous, almost offensive. How could I doubt the man who had been by my side through every significant moment of our lives together? As the weeks went by, I tried to brush off the unease that Sarah's words had caused. I focused on our family, on the holidays ahead, and on the simple joys of our daily routine. Michael seemed as present and engaged as ever, his demeanor unchanged at work or at home, reflecting none of the suspicions that Sarah had subtly tried to plant. Then, that lunch in December was a turning point that forced me to confront the nagging doubt that Sarah's strange behavior had instilled. We met at a small cafe, a neutral space away from the familiar settings of work or home. Sarah seemed particularly tense that day. Her usual vibrant self was overshadowed by a seriousness that immediately put me on edge. We ordered our food and exchanged the usual pleasantries, but as the waiter walked away, Sarah's demeanor changed. She looked around to make sure there were no familiar faces within earshot, and then she turned to me with a seriousness that instantly chilled the air between us. "Emily, I've been beating around the bush for too long, and I'm sorry. I have something important to tell you." "Something important about Michael," she said, her voice low and steady. She began to speak about him and a student. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The vague hints, the change in behavior, all of it had led to this moment. Despite my deepest fears, I had believed in my husband's fidelity and the sanctity of our life together. But Sarah's next words would challenge everything I thought I knew and force me to look beyond the veneer of normalcy that I had clung to so tightly. She blurted out a suspicion that had apparently been bothering her for some time. Something, she suggested, might be going on between Michael and a medical student. Specifically, a bright young woman who was not just any student but one who seemed to see Michael not only as a mentor but perhaps something more. Michael had always maintained a professional detachment bordering on aloofness. His interactions with students were uniformly marked by respect. I laughed it off at first. It seemed so out of character for the man I knew, the man with whom I had spent nearly a decade of my life, who had always seemed as devoted to me and our daughter as he was on the day we exchanged our vows. But as Sarah described what she called the longing looks exchanged in the corners of classrooms and hallways, my laughter began to sound hollow even to my own ears. What I had thought was the routine I cherished was just a facade, perhaps hiding something I was too afraid to acknowledge. Despite my initial dismissal, Sarah's words planted a seed of doubt, one that, unbeknownst to me, was about to sprout into a confrontation that would challenge everything I thought I knew about our seemingly perfect life. She sat down, took a deep breath, and said, "There's something I've been wanting to talk to you about, and I'm not really sure how to say it." Her voice was serious, and I felt a pang of fear. From the seriousness of her tone, this was not our usual gossip or chat about departmental politics. Something was wrong. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to hide my concern with a sip of my tea. "It's about Michael," she started. My heart sank. "I've noticed something," she paused, searching for the right words. "It's about how he is with one of the medical students." I felt a jolt. Michael had always been professional, a model professor. The suggestion that there might be something inappropriate was hard to fathom. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" My voice came out a little sharper than I intended. She flinched slightly, which only made my stomach tighten more. "I've seen them together, and it's just the way they look at each other." I had known Michael for years. "He's never looked at anyone else like that, not even close," she continued, her eyes now meeting mine with a mixture of concern and apology. "Sarah, you're basing this on looks?" I couldn't hide my incredulity. The idea seemed absurd, pulled out of thin air, or perhaps from some daytime drama. It was unlike Sarah to make such vague accusations. "Yes, I know it sounds crazy," she admitted, rubbing her temples. "I wouldn't have said anything if it wasn't so obvious. It's like watching a slow, burn romance movie. He looks at her the way he used to look at you." The words stung more than I expected. A vivid image of Michael's tender glances in our early days flashed through my mind, his eyes filled with unspoken words and promises. It was painful to think of those looks being directed at anyone else, let alone a student. "I'm sure you're thinking too much," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "Michael is dedicated to his work and to us. He wouldn't jeopardize that. It's probably just professional admiration or something. You know how passionate he is about mentoring." Sarah nodded, looking relieved that I wasn't overly upset, but still unconvinced. "Maybe, but just look at her." "Okay, I hope I'm wrong." "I really do." The rest of our lunch passed in a blur. I kept replaying Sarah's words in my head. Each repetition chipped away at my certainty. By the time we parted, a seed of doubt had been firmly planted, despite my best efforts to dismiss it. That evening, when Michael came home and wrapped me in a warm, familiar embrace, I tried to see any hint of what Sarah had mentioned. He was the same as he had always been with me, caring, loving, asking about my day with genuine interest. But now, a filter of suspicion clouded my perception of his every action. Later, as we settled in after dinner, I casually brought it up. "Sarah and I had lunch today," I mentioned, watching his face for any sign of change. "Oh," he replied, looking up from a book. "How was she?" "Good. She mentioned something funny, though." I forced a smile to keep the mood light. "She thinks you have a crush on one of your students." He laughed, dismissing it as ridiculous. Despite Michael's denials and his sudden criticism of Sarah, something inside me refused to calm down. His words, meant to cast doubt on Sarah's integrity and divert attention from himself, only fueled my determination to uncover the truth. How could he suddenly turn on Sarah, a friend who had been nothing but supportive of both of us? His accusations seemed like desperate attempts to protect himself, and the discrepancy between his words and his actions left a bitter taste in my mouth. I maintained a composed facade, laughing at the right moments, nodding along to his explanations, and pretending to consider his perspective. But beneath this calm exterior, my mind was racing, piecing together every odd remark, every late night at the office, every unexplained absence that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on new meaning. I knew I needed more than just my instincts and Michael's word against Sarah's. I needed hard evidence, something undeniable. I even considered looking at our phone records, something I had never felt the need to do before in our marriage. It felt like a betrayal on my part. Part of me felt that looking at the phone records was a violation of the trust we had built over the years, but these were desperate times. The phone records showed nothing out of the ordinary at first glance. There were calls to colleagues, his secretary, his brother. But then I noticed a number that kept coming up more often than others, at odd hours. Sometimes, it was late at night. It was a number I didn't recognize, and my heart sank. As I scribbled it down, a sense of betrayal washed over me. The next thing I knew, I was at our computer at home. Michael was usually meticulous about logging out of his accounts, but he'd become complacent. Maybe he was too confident in his ability to cover his tracks. I found his email open, with a thread highlighted. As I clicked on it, I braced myself for what I might find. The emails were carefully worded, but the underlying tone was unmistakable. The relationship between Michael and this person was more than that of a professor and a student. There was a personal touch to the exchange of academic pleasantries, a warmth that should not have been there. Even with this information, I still felt hollow. Confirmation of Michael's deception didn't bring the satisfaction I'd hoped for. Instead, it only added to the pain with each piece of evidence. Our marriage felt more like a lie, and the man I thought I knew was slipping away. But I decided not to confront him over the next few days. My interactions with Michael continued as normal. We talked about mundane things, Sophie's schedule, groceries, the minutiae of daily life. These conversations didn't touch the raw nerve of our fractured relationship. My world was in chaos, but I maintained a calm exterior. He was none the wiser, perhaps believing that we were slowly bridging the gap between us. In reality, I was meticulously planning my next steps and gathering more evidence. The weekend was approaching, and I had plans with the Nursing Mothers Association. It was a group I had joined after Sophie's birth, and they had organized a camping trip. This was the perfect alibi to leave home for an extended period of time without raising suspicion. I informed Michael only a few days in advance, claiming that it would be a good bonding experience for Sophie and me and a refreshing break for me. He reacted with enthusiasm, overly so, which now seemed like another red flag in his recent behavior. "Have a great time," he said, smiling. "You both deserve this break. Don't worry about anything." His ready acceptance of our absence gave me the window I needed. I had arranged for a neighbor, Jenna, ostensibly to check on our house in my absence, but in reality to monitor Michael's movements when he thought he was unobserved. Jenna was a trusted friend who was aware of my situation and willing to help. The camping trip itself was a much-needed distraction. Being around other women, sharing stories and laughter, allowed me to breathe a little easier, if only for a day. Sophie loved the outdoors. Her laughter mingled with the breeze, and it was a joy to see her find happiness in the simple things, a butterfly, the crackle of a campfire. This helped lift some of the weight off my chest. Meanwhile, Jenna was texting me updates. Michael had left the house in the morning and didn't return until late afternoon. She couldn't see where he was going, but she noted the time. When he returned, he brought someone with him. My heart sank when I read her message. The visitor was female, young, and they seemed too comfortable together. Jenna couldn't get close enough to hear what they were saying without risking being seen, but she managed to take a few pictures from her window. She also noted that they returned home late. On Sunday, I felt a mixture of fear and anger. The atmosphere in the house was too quiet. I greeted Michael too casually, and he asked about the trip. His curiosity seemed feigned. I recounted anecdotes from our trip, all the while feeling a sickening mixture of betrayal and determination. The next day, after Michael left for work and Sophie was at her daycare, I met with Jenna to collect the photos. The pictures were grainy, but the intimacy between Michael and the woman was unmistakable. Their closeness, their body language, and the ease between them was more than enough to confirm my suspicions. Armed with this new evidence, I knew I had to confront Michael. But first, I needed more concrete evidence, something undeniable that would stop him from weaving more lies. I contacted a private investigator recommended by a friend. Discretion was key, and the investigator assured me that he could discreetly track Michael's movements and interactions over the next few weeks. As the investigation unfolded, I maintained a veneer of normalcy at home. Michael seemed oblivious to the undercurrents. Perhaps he was blinded by his own duplicity or convinced of his ability to hide his affair. But the strain of living a double life, playing the role of the dutiful wife while secretly orchestrating an investigation into my husband's infidelity, was exhausting. After a few weeks, the investigator provided me with a report that included times, places, and even audio recordings of conversations between Michael and the student. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. They spoke of their feelings for each other and their plans to keep their relationship secret until the right time, whatever that meant. I felt a cold determination settle in. This was not just a fleeting mistake on Michael's part, but a calculated betrayal. I decided it was time to confront him. I scheduled the confrontation for one night when Sophie was staying over at a friend's house. I didn't want her to witness the potential fallout. When Michael came home, I sat in the living room, the pile of evidence, emails, photos, and the investigator's report, on the coffee table in front of me. He sensed something was wrong right away. He walked in, his smile fading as he saw the documents and photos spread out. His eyes widened as he took in the implications. "Emily, what is this?" His voice was shaky, the usual confidence was gone. "It's over, Michael," I said quietly, my voice calm despite the turmoil inside. "I know everything. There's no point in denying it any longer." He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. The next few hours were a blur of tears and confessions. Michael begged for forgiveness, promised to end the affair and do whatever it took to fix our marriage. But something inside me was broken. The trust had been shattered beyond repair, and no amount of remorse could rebuild it. So I asked him to leave to give me space to think about the future. He left with a small suitcase of his belongings. The house felt empty, and the silence was in stark contrast to the chaos of emotion that had filled it just hours before. In the days that followed, I met with my attorney to discuss the next steps. Divorce seemed inevitable. This was not out of spite, but out of necessity, to rebuild a stable, honest life for Sophie and myself. As I navigated the complexities of separation and legal proceedings, I also reached out to a therapist to begin dealing with the emotional fallout of the betrayal. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, I felt a sense of control over my own life. Looking back, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss for the marriage I had envisioned and the partner I had believed Michael to be. But there was also a growing sense of resilience, a belief that whatever came next, I could build a new life for Sophie and myself, one rooted in honesty and strength. The journey was just beginning, but I was ready to face it head on.